Austin, Texas, December 6, 1991. Nobody locks the door when they feel safe. That was his first advantage. The second was the fire. December 6, 1991, began without a single warning, no trembling in the cold Texas air, no instinct clawing at the back of anyone's neck. Just an ordinary Friday night draped casually over a city that had never once imagined what was already moving through its streets. Something patient, something deliberate, something that had done this before and had already decided it would do it again. 4 girls were inside that little shop on Jollyville Road. They were laughing about something. Nobody remembers what. By midnight, the laughter was gone. By morning, something had entered Austin, Texas that no prayer, no investigation, no courtroom, no confession, and no amount of desperate human justice could remove for the next 34 years. A silence so deep, so suffocating, so monstrously permanent that an entire city learned to breathe around it rather than through it. He walked out into that silence, pulled his collar up against the cold, and disappeared into the most ordinary night imaginable, as though nothing had happened, as though 4 girls were still laughing inside 4 girls. One night, 34 years of silence so loud it swallowed innocent men whole, destroyed families completely, and let a monster sleep peacefully in his bed until a 13-year-old girl, even from beyond the grave, reached out and grabbed him by the throat. This story isn't finished yet, not by a long way. So hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me something in the comments. Did you think justice was even possible after 34 years? Or had you already given up on it? Because Amy hadn't. She never did. And because of that, one of the most chilling, most devastating, most electrifying true crime stories in American history is only just beginning. Stay with me. Part 2. The Ashes of Innocence. Cold open. The smoke didn't just clear, it revealed an impossible nightmare. By 2 a.m. on December 7th, 1991, the bright pink neon sign of the Austin yogurt shop was dark. Inside, 4 bodies lay in the ash. Amy, Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, bound, gagged, executed. The sheer brutality fractured the mind of every detective on the scene. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution disguised as an accident. Then came the first catastrophic mistake. In the chaos of the fire, thousands of gallons of water rushed through the building, washing away crucial footprints, melting fibers, and drowning the evidence. The killer had used the ultimate weapon, fire. It didn't just destroy the shop, it vaporized the clues. Investigators stood in the ruins with nothing, no weapon, no forced entry, no eyewitnesses, just a sleeping city outside and a killer who had already vanished into thin air. The primary question wasn't just who did this. It was how did someone walk into a popular shop, subdue 4 girls without a single scream being heard from the street, and walk out unseen? Austin was terrified. The parents were broken, and the police were desperate. So desperate, they were about to make a choice that would ruin innocent lives for the next 3 decades. Part 3. The case starts to rot from inside Austin, Texas, 1992-1993. At first, it looked like progress. That's how every failed investigation begins to feel when pressure replaces clarity. The city needed answers. The media demanded movement. The families refused silence. And inside that storm, detectives began doing what exhausted systems always do when truth refuses to appear. They started building one, not intentionally, not maliciously, but slowly, dangerously. They began stitching fragments of rumor, fear, and half-remembered statements into something that looked like a suspect. And once a face enters an investigation, everything changes. Evidence stops leading the case starts bending the evidence, Interviews became interrogations, interrogations became pressure chambers, and under that weight, people broke. Some confessed to things they didn't do, some agreed to details suggested by investigators just to escape the room. And every time a confession fell apart later, it left behind something worse than nothing. It left behind doubt in the real truth. Because while police chased unstable leads, the actual killer remained completely untouched. No name, no profile, no pattern they could see clearly enough to act on. Just silence. But silence is not empty. It was moving. Quietly expanding beyond Austin, beyond one crime scene, into other towns, other victims, other reports that never got connected because no one knew they were supposed to be connected. A shadow pattern was forming across Texas, but investigators only saw isolated dots, separate tragedies, unrelated events. They didn't realize they were watching a single mind repeat itself, perfecting itself, learning from every mistake the system made. And then came the moment that should have broken the case wide open. A piece of biological evidence so small it almost didn't matter at the time was recovered, logged, stored, forgotten in a system that wasn't ready for what it meant. Inside it was the truth. Inside it was the killer. But in the early 90s, that truth was useless because the world still didn't know how to read it. And so the evidence slept. While innocent men were questioned, while families buried hope, while the city convinced itself it was getting closer, the real answer sat locked in a lab drawer, waiting for science to catch up with horror. And somewhere out there in the same ordinary streets, the man responsible kept walking, unnoticed, unchallenged, unfinished. Part 4. The confessions that broke the truth. By the time the case reached its middle years, the investigation was no longer searching for truth. It was searching for an end. And in that desperate search, something dangerous began to happen. Answers started forming before evidence did. Pressure builds its own reality inside an unsolved crime. Detectives begin to feel time closing in on them. Supervisors want results. Headlines demand closure. Families beg for names. And slowly, without anyone openly admitting it, the goal shifts from who did this to who can we make fit this. That is when the case began to fracture. Suspicion started attaching itself to men who already lived on the edge of society, people with troubled histories, unstable pasts, or simply the misfortune of being noticed at the wrong time. Interrogations grew longer, questions became sharper, silence in the room became a tool instead of a pause. And eventually, the first confessions arrived. But they did not arrive like truth. They arrived like collapse, hours of questioning, repeated scenarios, suggested details, exhaustion so deep it blurs memory into imagination. Under that weight, statements began to change shape. At first, small inconsistencies, then full narratives bending toward what investigators believed they already knew. And once a confession exists in a file, it changes everything around it. Even when it breaks under evidence later, it does not disappear. It leaves residue. It leaves certainty in the minds of people who never read the fine details. It leaves headlines that travel further than corrections ever will. But in the cold light of forensic review, none of it held. Timelines failed. Physical evidence contradicted statements. Details unraveled one by one until what looked like resolution turned back into confusion. Every supposed answer created two new questions. And behind all of it, something far more terrifying remained untouched. Because while attention moved from suspect to suspect, from confession to confession, from mistake to mistake, the actual crime scene evidence was still waiting, preserved, cataloged, stored away in silence. A fragment of truth so small it meant nothing at the time, but would one day mean everything. The case had split in two without anyone realizing it. One version lived in interrogation rooms, newspapers, and public belief. The other stayed frozen in a lab, where science had not yet caught up to what it was holding. And between those two worlds, the real killer remained invisible, not hiding, not running, just existing in plain sight as the investigation slowly turned away from him, again and again, without ever knowing it. Part 5. The silence finally breaks final. For years, the case stayed frozen in contradiction. Confessions that didn't match evidence, suspects that didn't fit the timeline, leads that collapsed under their own weight, and a city slowly learning how to live beside an unanswered question that refused to die. But what the investigation couldn't solve in its own time, science was quietly preparing to finish. Deep in storage, preserved from the earliest hours of the crime scene, was something almost invisible. Something so small that in the 1990s it could only be collected, not fully understood. A trace. A fragment of biological truth left behind in violence, unnoticed by everyone except the victim who fought back in her final moments. And then, years later, everything changed. Technology advanced, methods sharpened. What once was meaningless evidence suddenly became readable history. And when the sample was finally tested again, it didn't just suggest a possibility. It pointed somewhere specific, not a rumor, not a confession, a match. The truth that had been buried under decades of noise finally had a voice. The identity of the attacker was no longer theory, no longer debate, no longer guesswork built on pressure and fear. It was written in biology, and the most chilling part was not just who it pointed to, but how long he had been hiding in plain sight while the world argued over the wrong answers. A man who was never truly missing, only overlooked. The case that once defined failure in American investigations finally had its turning point, but it came too late to restore what had been taken. 4 lives were gone, years had been lost, and dozens of wrong paths had already left their own scars on innocent people caught in the system's panic. Justice did not arrive as celebration, it arrived as silence. Heavy, final, unforgiving. Because sometimes solving a crime doesn't undo it. It only confirms how long the truth was ignored, and what it cost while it waited. This is the story of the yogurt shop murders. Not just a case, but a warning about how fragile truth becomes when fear moves faster than facts. If this story shook you, take a second to do 3 things. Hit like. If you want more deep true crime breakdowns like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Comment below your thoughts. Do you think justice was finally served, or did it come too late to matter? And share this video with someone who believes every case has a simple answer, because this one proved it never does. Stay aware, stay curious, and never trust silence too easily.